Jim of Shiloh Kahal. I recently produced and then published a video I've entitled Miaton Sabbaton, Testing the Perspective of a Greek Scholar, and I made that 3/19 of 2026. Let me just play the quick intro so you can see what it's about, and I'll read it for you. Ti Miaton Sabbaton. Why is on one of the Sabbaths translated as the first day of the week? Ti Miaton Sabbaton, testing and evaluating information and perspective of an apparent Greek scholar. Well, this is a 2-hour, 48-minute video, and that's a large chunk. But if you want all of the arguments, the discussion between myself, that's the idea. I engaged with an apparent Greek scholar who gave me the rationale and how and why we get to first day of the week. And then I tested it all. That's what this video is all about. If you want the nuts and bolts of the arguments I make, then that's where you go to find it. And I just completed, but have not yet published, one that I'm calling Miaton Sabbaton, Cut to the Chase, because I'm trying to find ways to take a 3-hour video that's too much for people to invest in and get them narrowed down to the crux, which is cutting to the chase. So in that video, didn't turn out to be as short as I wanted. It also turned out to be a 45-minute video, but rather than give you all the nuts and bolts, I just got to the conclusions and focused on the idea of Sabbaths being, the retranslating of Sabbaths into week being the primary cause of the problem, and the primary foul, for lack of a better way to say it, the primary foul being committed to get to the support of church doctrines. I haven't published that yet, but that'll go out too. This video is intended to expound upon why that doctrine is important and what has happened to the church, the actual people of the church, the elect, the chosen, and how they have been influenced by church teaching and how that has confused the issue. And I want to see if I can bring some proper context and understanding to the events so that the church who will listen and hear can understand what was happening that week in question and how all of this really pertains. So that's the point of this video. Okay, before I focus on one, let's see if we could take a broad brush of what I'm talking about here. So I just Googled Sabbath as week. Idea was trying to find conversations related to how Sabbath was translated as week. Well, the first thing we get is a definition of Sabbath from Wikipedia, but that's not what we're interested in. But here we've got the second one that pops is Sabbath, Sabbaths or week related to Matthew 28. And the caption is the word translated week is indeed Sabbaths. And let me just quickly go visit that. So we have someone who would be apparently of the church because they have knowledge. So they're asking, first of all, they're reading Matthew 21 from the English Standard Version, the ESV. And it reads like this in the English Standard Version. Now, after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And here's the Greek for it, and here's the word Sabbaton. And here is their question. But the word here is Sabbaton. Sabbaton, plural. So one would think it would be Sabbaths. However, all major translations have it just Sabbath, and then they list ESV, KJV, New King James, NIV, NASB, NET, RSV, the major translations. Looking closer, this exact form of the word is translated as Sabbath singular in English in some places, and elsewhere it is referring to the week. So, and I'll go one step further, because elsewhere it's also literally means Sabbaths. So you're going to see Sabbaton, this word in question. I'm sorry, I'm interjecting here. You're going to see Sabbaton translated in the plural form of Sabbaton. You're going to see in English how it gets translated in the singular Sabbath at different times. And then you're also going to see where the same word is being translated as the week, although it's not the only word that is being translated as week. Sabbatou is also being translated, which is a singular form of Sabbath, is also being translated as week. So that's the confusion, though. They're getting this Sabbaton being translated sometimes as Sabbath and sometimes as the week. And they're questioning why. Why is it being translated this way, and how should Matthew 28 be translated in light of it? I'm particularly interested in the parallel verses of Mark 16:2 and Luke 24:1. They describe it as the first day of the week, because that's the English translation, but I'm going to say it's probably all translations that are born out of the church. While Matthew says after the Sabbath, is it simply a matter of sentence construction? Well, let's go look at this Matthew 28 that is in question, and what's driving her question or his question, whoever it is. Here's how it's written: after then Sabbaths, because this is the literal Greek up here. Sabbaton is the word in question. Here it is in Greek. Here's the transliterated Greek as Sabbaton, and literally word for word is after then Sabbaths. And they're questioning why then is this word being translated as Sabbaths here in the interlinear, because that's the literal plural translation. Why is it being translated as Sabbath? And then later in the very same sentence, it says it being dawned toward the first day of the week. And we've got the very same word here now being translated as the week. So the question is, why? How do we have it being translated as Sabbaths here and of the week here? But in the major translations, and let me just go get you one because I think the NASB will say that. Here's the NASB. Yeah, they're using the term Sabbath for Sabbaton. They're using Sabbath. That's driving their question. Well, why? That's a good question. And let's go see what their answer is. Well, you know what? Let me quickly go to Mark, because they were talking about Mark 16:2. And that then reads also, we have the same Sabbaton being translated as first day of the week, but we don't see Sabbath twice. We don't see this word twice in the same sentence. And their other concern was, let me go see, I think it was Luke 24:1. Yeah, Luke 24:1. Let's go look at it real quick. And that reads, here we've got the Sabbaton again, but we don't have it twice in the same sentence. And here they are treating that as first day of the week again. So that's what's driving their question. And let's go see what answer they give. There looks like there are some more questions here. I didn't read this too closely, but here's the answers that everybody, I don't know who's giving the answers, but it looks like it would be like a forum where people are giving the answers. Well, here's one of the answers. Matthew 28 is an obscure use of the preposition after. Okay, so they're getting to, let me get back to Matthew 28. And they're talking about this word here being after. So they're saying that's part of their understanding. After, which means after, when taking the genitive plural. This is interesting because that adjective then is a plural adjective. This is explained in Blas et al. And they're explaining it away. And I'm not going to try, I didn't go there. I'm not going to try to go there. It is also discussed in this book, but ultimately they're saying that this word appears only 7 times. This word after, in context of a genitive plural, it occurs only 7 times in the entire Greek Bible, which they're saying is the new writings, which I have shared, and also the Septuagint. So here's the answer they provide. How should Matthew 28 be translated? Is probably after the Sabbath. So they're saying that it literally should have been after the Sabbath, as most versions have it, and not after the Sabbaths, as it occasionally appears. I don't think there is any inconsistency in the parallel passages of Mark 16:2-5 or Luke 24, and also John 21, where the first day of the week, according to Jewish reckoning, interesting, is the day following the Sabbath. The first day of the week is the day. Yep. All 4 accounts agree with the event took place on the first day of the week. Mark says it was very early in the morning. Matthew adds the additional detail, not really. Okay. Then they have some more explanations. All 4 accounts use the same to identify the day of the resurrection. So they are basically saying that all 4 accounts are being used to identify the day of the resurrection, which is critically important because they're saying now after the Sabbath toward the dawn of the first day of the week, because this is the identified first day of the week is the day of the resurrection. Okay. Same thing here. So let me leave this one, and because I'm going to get to a specific, I'm going to break one down, and it's actually this next one. Here, what is this one? Why is Sunday observed as a Sabbath day instead of Saturday? One of the issues that I'm talking about. Why are we observing Sunday? And this whole issue that I'm talking about, Timiaton, Sabbaton, is foundational to the idea that we are observing Sunday rather than Sabbath. Sunday is a Sabbath day instead of Saturday, which would be the first day of the week as the day of the Sabbath versus the 7th day of the week. But here's the one I'm going to evaluate a little more deeply. And it was in Jason Staples' his website where the question was posed and he gave an answer. And I'm going to focus on this one because while there are many other versions and ways that we could talk about how first day of the week is influencing our the understanding and the doctrines of the church in church teaching. There are multiple ways. This is a very good and representative one, and I'm just going to use it as the basis for this video. So here I've produced that web page as a PDF document so that I can mark it up. And here's the question: Sabbath or week? Question mark. When words mean more than one thing. And this is kind of the crux of the point. They're making Sabbath mean more than one thing, and they're introducing week. Okay, so here's how it reads. One of my commenters has asked an excellent question about Matthew chapter 28, verse 1, and several other verses centering on the fact that the Greek word Sabbaton, which is Sabbath, or week, which occurs twice in the verse, is translated differently each time. He observes that the same word, which is Strong's reference number 4521, seems to be translated several different ways depending upon context. Finally asking, the word, here's Sabbath, I believe that is, let me confirm what that is. Okay, I thought it was, but I just confirmed that this word here is Sabbaton. And it's transliterated as Sabbaton, which is the dative neuter plural form. So this is a plural form of Sabbath, but that is not being used in these passages that are being translated as weeks, just FYI. Then he shows us Sabbaton, which is being translated. This is the genitive neuter plural form of that noun. And then we have this one, which is Sabbatu, which is not to be confused with Sabbaton, because up here is Sabbaton. Well, here, I'll just show you. This one is Sabbatu, which is, and Sabbatu is spelled S-A, here, let me just show you. This one is Sabbatu, spelled S-A-B-B-A-T-O-U-E. Here is the word that's in question. Here was the first word they gave us in Greek, and here's what it means, it's how it's transliterated. It's Sabbaton, and it's the dative neuter plural form. Here is Sabbaton that they gave us, which is transliterated as Sabbaton, which is the genitive neuter plural form. And then they gave us this word in Greek, which is transliterated as Sabbatu, which is the genitive neuter singular form. So this word in red and this word are both the genitive case. One is plural, Sabbaton, and one of them is singular, Sabbatu. So these tend to have the most similar meaning. Sabbaton is actually a dative form of the neuter noun. The other word that they offered us is this one up here, which is a different word, and it is Sabbaton. It's up here. It is this word, actually it's down here. It's this word right here, and it is the Greek, Strong's handles this as the base word, this singular form, which is it's both the accusative and nominative case of the word Sabbath. Both are neuter and both are singular. It's singular in nature, but it's the nominative and accusative form that this shows up in. But he's actually referenced then 4 different versions of the word Sabbath. But the 2 that are in question that are getting translated in the manner that they are talking about is Sabbaton and Sabbatu, just to help you keep that in mind. Okay, what do these words mean by themselves? Well, I will tell you what the words mean by themselves is Sabbath. Now, in our world today, Sabbath is not quite so clear-cut because we're treating Sunday as Sabbath. I don't think it'd be too uncommon at all to find somebody referring to Sunday as a Sabbath. But in the time frame in question when these passages were penned, nobody misunderstood what Sabbath was. Sabbath was Torah. It was foundational to the Israeli culture, to the Hebrew culture. It was foundational. And everybody understood it to be the 7th day. There was no question because it was the 4th command. It was just all part of the old writing scriptures. Nobody was confused. Okay, so just to say again, what do these words by themselves mean? Well, in the context, it would have meant the Sabbath and specifically the 7th day Sabbath. It goes on to say, I believe that the true word of God, okay, this is the commenter. I believe that the true word of God is the divinely inspired in the original manuscript form, the Hebrew, I think he means from the Hebrew and the Greek, and translated versions in any language are not in any way divinely inspired. Okay, at its core, and I think we all agree that when the writer of any of the scriptures were penned, and I'm specifically thinking of the old writings, they would have been divinely inspired, and we can't trust. The essence of it is we can't really trust the translations that came along after, because men start getting involved in it, just in the same way that the oral traditions became involved with Torah, so do the traditions of men become involved in these translations. Now, I will go on to say that I know that most of the church want to treat the writings that followed, the gospel accounts and then the letters of Paul and all this, as divinely inspired word of Elohim. And it may be, but they weren't asserting it. Paul wasn't asserting it with every one of his letters. And I don't think Matthew, Mark, or John were ever asserting that, they were being divinely inspired. They were just simply putting forth their accounts and writing letters of instruction. That's how they understood what they were doing and writing. Do we want to treat them as scripture, as though they're inerrant words of God? I guess, but I think that I would be going beyond what I think they would have said about their own writings. But even if we were, and we would say that whatever Paul penned and whatever Luke penned and whatever Matthew penned, it's inspired word of Elohim, still the translations that followed are to be questioned, and we wonder about it because they are not that divinely inspired and could have the involvement of men and the enemy, which is Hasatan, the enemy, the devil. Okay. And when the translators didn't understand something, they felt they needed to find a way to make it fit. Well, this is a very important statement, because that's really that's one of the cruxes of the problem. Timiaton Sabbaton, meaning on one of the Sabbaths, is a problem when you have church doctrine teaching that Yahushua or Jesus rose on the first day. And you've created a Lord's Day, you've created the Easter Day, the Day of Resurrection and the celebration thereof, the Lord's Day, the idea that it's foundational to the idea of the introduction of a new covenant, as though we're in the new covenant now. The new covenant is definitely coming, but the church teaches that we're in it now and that we're experiencing that new covenant now. And so this is all foundational. That idea that we're operating in the new covenant is, we get to the idea that Yahushua, Jesus, fulfilled the whole concept of Sabbath, fulfillment of the Torah, fulfillment in such a way. Church doctrine, not from Scripture. It's not born out of Scripture. It's born out of church doctrine. So what do we have? We have Timiaton Sabbaton that would absolutely be working against church doctrine. It is a problem, and so it can't be allowed to stand. Hence, in my opinion, the formation of first day of the week. So they're starting from the concept that it must be, these events happened on the first day of the week. They must have happened on the first day of the week, because that's what the church teaches me. So when they get to the scriptures that are saying didn't happen on the first day of the week, it happened the day prior, the seventh day, the Sabbath day, that's a problem, and they need to fix it so that it fits the church doctrine. And that's what, without saying that, they didn't realize that's what they were saying, but that's what they're saying. When the translators didn't understand something, they felt they needed to find a way to make it fit. Well, I would say, they understand, the translators who speak Greek, they understand what they're reading. Timiaton Sabbaton. And there are a couple different ways you can insert the ellipsis, the word that needs to be supplied to make it grammatically correct, which is day. A couple different ways you can supply that word and retain the meaning of the Sabbath, and they knew it, but they couldn't have it be Sabbath day. They need it to be, the first day of the week, and they have a process that gets them to that first day of the week. But that is an example of that process. Just to reiterate here, that I don't think it's a matter of misunderstanding something. They understood what they read, but it couldn't be. They needed it to be something else, and so they felt they needed to find a way to make it fit their doctrines. Even though they understood it, it's not a matter of misunderstanding. They understood it. They just need to make it fit. Big statement that he made, and it's so true. And in doing so, did a great injustice to the original word. So when they see the Sabbath written 2 times in Matthew 28:1, it didn't make sense, because in their minds, they thought, how can the Sabbath be on Sunday when the seventh-day Sabbath was sanctified by God from the beginning? Well, I'm going to say this is how this person sees it, but I think all of these statements are born out of ignorance. They do not understand what took place in the week that was involved, because Matthew 28 is describing the resurrection week. And when they say, I would tell you the Greek translators understood it. They understood it while this gentleman or this person did not. Because when they see it written 2 times in Matthew, the translators knew that the first Sabbath they are referring was not the weekly Sabbath, but the Sabbath of the Moedim, Feast of Unleavened Bread. Because the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread is a Sabbath day. That is the day that Yahushua was crucified on. And that was a Sabbath. So that was the first of the Sabbath. So when we read in Matthew, let me get it. When we read in Matthew 28, when they say, after then the Sabbaths, now, I know that Sabbaths is still difficult, but I'll explain another way that it could mean. For whatever reason, this is what they wrote, and they said Sabbaton, but they understood it after the Sabbath. They knew they were talking about after that midweek Sabbath of the Moedim, which was the Sabbath, first day of unleavened bread. And then when they say it being dawned toward the first day of the week, which is this Sabbaton, they knew that now they're talking about the seventh day Sabbath that is coming here a little bit later in the week on the seventh day, because literally that Sabbath, that first Sabbath occurred on I think it would be, it'd be the, what would that be? Sorry, I wanted to confirm it. That would be the 4th day of the week, and this is the 7th day of the week. The Greek translators knew that. They were not confused as this person is suggesting. So when they see the Sabbath written 2 times in Matthew, it didn't make sense. No, it made sense to them. And not in their minds, they thought, how can the Sabbath be on Sunday when the 7th-day Sabbath was sanctified by Elohim from the beginning? Both of those Sabbaths were sanctified. So this person's confused because the church hasn't taught them. All of this first day of the week has confused people. If the correct doctrines had been taught in the church from the beginning, nobody would be confused about this. They would know because they'd be celebrating that Moedim. They would understand. One of the things that happens is nobody in modern church today celebrates the Moedim. Nobody understands the Feast of Unleavened Bread had a Sabbath day associated with it, so it's lost on them. They think they're talking about the previous 7th day and the coming 7th day. And all of that's creating confusion, but I don't think that existed. It might exist in some of the minds of some of the translators, but I would say that the translators, when they get this involved, if you're going to get so involved that you're involved in the translation of Greek into English, you probably know this. I think it'd be unusual that they wouldn't know. So an argument is made for the use of plural Sabbaths as it is found in Matthew 28. An argument is made that the use of the plural Sabbaths as it is found in Matthew 28 somehow means between the Sabbaths. Well, okay. That's them trying to justify, which allows a change from Sabbaths to week. Maybe, but I don't really think that's what's justifying a change from Sabbaths to week. Let me go on, finish his statement. But there are only 6 days between the Sabbaths. Therefore, week and between the Sabbaths could not be synonymous. Okay? In Luke 18:12, the word in the original is Sabbath, singular, yet the translators dared to translate this also as week. But let me, before I go on to the answer that is provided. Oh, well, I guess, is there more to his question? Okay, there's more to his question. Well, actually, here, let me finish this and then I'll go on. So if Matthew was to be changed, it could read something like this. In the end of the Sabbath, at the dawning toward the first day of the Sabbath, came Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to see the sepulcher to expound, and then to expand upon it. Now that the era, this is also, I am going to come back to this because this is so foundational to, this is church teaching. But let's go back up here and look at his passage in question, Matthew 28, and the things that circumstance, facts that are not being brought into the discussion that he lacks. He lacks critical information to be making this information. Let me go to let me pull up the scripture. So here's Matthew. First of all, when we say after then the Sabbaths, first of all, it could be after the Sabbath because we would have known. I mean, there's a reasonable case to say after the Sabbath, And that making sense because we're only talking about one Sabbath on the fourth day. But let me explain another possibility and probability in my mind is why we might be saying Sabbath. And that's because we saw two Sabbaths celebrated in that week prior to the end of the week Sabbath. This Sabbath here, the end of the week that they're calling the first day of the week, this Sabbaton here was, nobody's questioning that that is the seventh day Sabbath. Well, I mean, obviously, if you're reading the modern English, actually, the translations, I'm going to say the church-sponsored translations, well, you're understanding this to be first day of the week, but I don't think so. In the Greek, you would not misunderstand it. You understand this day to be the seventh day Sabbath that came along on the seventh day. But what would these Sabbaths be? Well, as I mentioned, you have the Sabbath of the Moedim, which would have been on the 15th, which would have been the fourth day of the week, according to the Zadokian calendar and the ways and the calendar that Yahushua was keeping. Because if you go to the gospel accounts, you will see that Yahushua and his disciples did the preparation day on the 14th and celebrated Passover on the 14th as prescribed in Torah. Then the next day would have been the Sabbath, which would have been the 15th. So that 14th occurred on the third day of the week, which would be in our times Tuesday. The Sabbath day for the Feast of Unleavened Bread was the next day and occurred on the fourth day of the week, which would have been Wednesday in our counting of weeks today. But the vast majority of the Yehudim, which would be the Jews and the Pharisees, were not keeping the same calendar that Yahushua was keeping. They were keeping the calendar that was brought into their lives in 175 BC when Antiochus Epiphanes kicked out the Zadokian priests from the leadership position in the high priesthood so that they could insert their calendar and insert their leaders who would support the calendar, first the Hellenistic priests, but later the Hasmoneans, which would be the Maccabean lineage, who then continued to support that new calendar. But one of the reasons that the sons of Zadok, the legitimate priesthood, could not accept the Hellenistic calendar, the Greek calendar, is that it would completely mess up the correct accounting of the Moedim and how they would keep the various feast days. Couldn't do it. And that's why they pushed back against Antiochus and the Greeks, who wanted them to embrace their calendar so that they had all of their kingdom on the same calendar, and pushed for it. Well, ultimately, the Greeks got their way because they removed the legitimate priest and inserted somebody who would accept the calendar. And by the time of Yahushua, over 200 years later, they were fully imbibed. They were fully engaged in the new calendar system, where I think they were celebrating an evening to evening day, as I think comes along with that Greek understanding and different things. And they were not celebrating the same days because with the change of the calendar systems, we get movement of the day. In the Zadokian calendar, Passover always happens on the third day. The Feast of Unleavened Bread always starts on the fourth day of the week. Always. Never doesn't. But in the Greek calendar, it doesn't always start on the third and fourth days. In fact, that week that we're talking about, which was the crucifixion week, literally, if you're reading the gospel accounts, you know that Yahushua celebrated the Passover on one day, and then the next day, while he was being crucified, the Hebrews, the Yehudim, the Pharisees, were treating this as their preparation day, a full day after, or a day after Yahushua did his preparation day. And then they were going to eat that Passover meal that night, a day after Yahushua ate his Passover meal. So literally, after they ate their Passover, they would have had another Sabbath day that the Yehudim were celebrating or honoring or observing. So you would have had two Sabbaths in that week. You would have had the Sabbath that Yahushua would have been keeping and the disciples would have been keeping. And I would say the Zadokians, the way those of Bethabara and the Qumran community would have been keeping Sabbath on that fourth day as prescribed by the legitimate Hebrew calendar. But the Pharisees were keeping the next day. They were treating the fourth day as their as their day of preparation, and then they would have been celebrating the Sabbath on the 5th day, which would have started, because they're going evening to evening, it would have started in that same evening, but they would have ultimately celebrated the next day, which would be the 5th day of the week, as their Sabbath. That would be the day that the communities would be closed. It'd be like our Sunday today, where everything's shut down and you can't go get the things. When Mary says they had to wait till the end of the Sabbath, they would probably find themselves not working on that Wednesday, because that's the true Sabbath, nor working on the Thursday, because that is the celebrated Sabbath of the Yehudim. So we have 2 Sabbaths in that week. So after then the Sabbaths, there would be 2 Sabbath celebrations that would have been observed in that week, one on Wednesday, one on Thursday, as we approach the 7th day Sabbath here. If you understand those things, it makes this sentence work. You do not have to manufacture anything. First of all, this Sabbaton on one Sabbath, on one of the Sabbath days, which is what I think this needs to be translated as, one of the Sabbath days, or one day of the Sabbath. You could do either one day of the Sabbath. But you've got the ellipsis here. You need to insert day here. So you have one day of the Sabbath, or one of the Sabbath days, literally meaning the weekly Sabbath. And then over here, the same word is being used because we're still talking about Sabbaths. One of them occurred on Wednesday, which would be the 15th on the true calendar. And one of them would have been Thursday, which would probably have been the 15th on the mainstream calendar of the day. So that's how you explain this away without, and maybe explain it away is the wrong way, but that's how you get to this. And you don't, it's none of this. It's none of this. They didn't understand. It's none of this struggling to get between the Sabbaths because you're trying to get between 7th day Sabbaths. It's none of that. You can take the passage literally according to the events that literally occurred in that week. So there's nothing we need to fix in that passage. Matthew 28, if you will understand the events of that week, makes perfect sense. But let's go and look at this passage that he's referencing here, Luke 18:12, because here's where they translated Sabbath apart from and the events of that resurrection week. Okay, so here's the passage in question. It's Luke 18:12. And the context of it is, here's Sabbatou, which is literally the same case, genitive case, but the singular form of the neuter noun Sabbath. And literally they're written on twice on the Sabbath. That's literally what's written. And I don't think you need to insert day here, because I don't think we have an issue with ellipsis or anything. So it can literally just be twice on the Sabbath, period. That's all they said. But the translators are all translating this as week. Daring to translate it as week? I suppose. I think it is daring to translate it as week. And I think they find as their basis for doing so 2 things. They've justified in all of these other passages in question the idea of treating Sabbath or Sabbaton or Sabbatou as week. They've justified it. But then this concept that they just don't think somebody can fast twice in a day. I think they misunderstand the idea of fast, in my opinion. So maybe they think that a fast is an all-day fast. To fast, you have to fast all day long. And then it would not make sense to say you fasted twice in a day if a fast is a full day. But what they don't understand is that you have different meals on the Sabbath. If you fast one, if you usually eat 3 and you fast breakfast and you fast lunch, you fasted twice in the same day. If later you also then eat the dinner, you only fasted twice in the day and you did not fast for the full 3 days. We see people doing this all the time. I get in a church that I had been taking part in. That was one of the things that we would do. First month of the year, we would start fasting during the day till 6 o'clock at night. So we would be fasting breakfast and lunch, calling that a fast, eating dinner, calling it a fast. We would have fasted twice in every day. So the idea that they translated Sabbatou into week, I think they dared. I think it's an injustice because they have no other reason other than maybe 2 reasons. They just can't imagine fasting twice in a day, or they really need to just add weight to what they've been doing throughout the rest of their translations, the other, 6 or 7, whatever it is, translations into week. Okay. Let's continue with this statement because this is so critical, because this is the effect. Ultimately, we are seeing the effect of the doctrines of the church who are reliant and dependent upon this being, all these events that the resurrection happened on the first day of the week. They're dependent upon it. And here's why, because here's what this person has been taught by the church. now that the era of the Old Testament Sabbaths has come to an end. That is such a huge statement because this passage is that justification, along with other church doctrines that come into this. In fact, he goes on to say, inasmuch, this is church doctrine, inasmuch as Jesus, who was typified by those Sabbaths, had finished his work and was now resting from his labors. So basically, this is church teaching. I challenge anybody to find that literally there is anything expressly stated where Yahushua was typified by those Sabbaths in the sense that he had finished his work, was now resting, and had put an end to the Sabbath. Find it. Show it to me. Maybe you could find and draw some things where you say he has finished his work and is now resting, but none of it is ever in context of the Torah, the fourth commandment, and changing the Sabbath day, the command to rest on that seventh day. Nowhere do we have anything in Scripture telling us this. We only have church doctrine that is driving this comment and this understanding. And the result of this is that we are not keeping the Sabbath anymore. The church has taught people to not keep the Sabbath anymore. Do not keep the seventh command, or treat the fourth command. But do not treat the seventh day as your Sabbath anymore, as commanded in Torah. Let's rearrange without authority, without authorization by Elohim. Let's go rearrange that to the first day of the week. That is not keeping Torah. That is not guarding Torah. That is taking liberties with Torah. And let's go on to, because he reveals more. The last seventh day Sabbath, like all the previous seventh day Sabbaths, pointed directly to the cross where Christ alone did all the work that was necessary to save those who believe on him. All right. Well, first of all, the cross was not, I just have to comment to this because this is church doctrine. First of all, the idea that there was a last seventh day Sabbath like all the previous day Sabbaths, where are you getting that? Only in church doctrine do you get that. Because nowhere in the Scriptures are they telling you we had a last observance of the seventh day Sabbath. We only get that from church teaching. And he also goes on to say where that last seventh day pointed directly to the cross where Christ alone did all the work that was necessary to save those who believe on him. Well, yes, the cross was part of all the work that he did to save those who believe on him, but that was not all the work that he did that was involved in our salvation. His entire walk was the work that he had to do. The cross was the end of it. It was the culmination of it. It was the finishing of it. But he had so many things he had to accomplish that were just as important as going to the cross was. They were all part of us getting to the resurrection. Had he not he needed to go to the cross that his sinless life could be given to us, offered to us, as our propitiation. He needed to do that, but he also just as much needed to walk. He needed to achieve all of the things that he achieved during his 3 years on earth to get to the point where he could be high priest, king, and savior, king of the coming kingdom of Elohim, the reign of Elohim that is existing up in the heavenlies now, but will be brought to earth at one time. So it's all much bigger than what church has taught this gentleman. But he's also using all of this to justify why we aren't keeping the Sabbath anymore. And that's the problem. That's the big problem. Rest on Jesus. Rest on Jesus. He has become our new Sabbath. We cannot do any work toward our salvation because he did all the work for us on the cross, so we must rest in him. Well, yes, he did all the work that we couldn't do to get us to the resurrection, but this whole concept, everything he just shared is absolutely just church doctrine, not supportable by the Scriptures themselves. You cannot do it by Scripture themselves. You must start bringing in the church doctrines, additional writings, additional papers where you have people adding to the very basic doctrines that you don't need to do. Because I'll just say it here, we never lost the Torah. We are not in a new covenant where all the commands are changed. We are still in the same covenant. We have just become partakers of that covenant alongside of Israel, as Paul teaches us. And now also subject to the same rules, because these are the ways of Elohim, and they will always be his ways. It's the way it always was. It's the way it always will be. Look at the passages when we start talking about how the New Jerusalem, how the promised land, when it comes back to us, when Yahushua comes that second time, Torah is coming back. And actually, Torah never left. It only left in modern Christianity because of the teachings of the church. All right, let's move on to his answer. This is dragging out longer than I'd hoped, but I think maybe it's important. So I don't know if this is correct, so I'm asking you to think. So this is the answer given to us. The question highlights exactly how Strong's Concordance, a wonderful tool, really can sometimes give just enough information to be dangerous for a person who doesn't know biblical languages. Okay. Well, I will agree that Strong's actually is supportive. I mean, Strong's is in the tank with the rest of the translations and the efforts to translate Timiaton Sabbaton into first day of the week. And everything you read will point you towards that. Actually, not everything, because there are things, and I noticed just today they've started changing some of their definitions and things. And I don't know if it's going to continue to morph. I really don't know. But there is some information where they know that the word is literally Sabbath, and like in the lexicon, they are still using Sabbath there. But when you get into every one of their pointing you to what this passage means, it will say first day of the week. So Strong's is supporting that, and it is dangerous. But then he goes on to say, and kind of differentiate for a person who doesn't know the biblical languages. And so he's going to assert, I think, by inference then, that he knows the biblical languages. Well, that'll be interesting to see. Maybe he's more familiar. Maybe he actually speaks the Greek language. I don't know. But maybe he's also just more familiar and has spent more time with it, which doesn't make him an expert in it. It's just... So I think that statement immediately causes my flags go up, because I just think he's going to assert himself as being the one who knows. Now, he's going to give some examples of where it's all bad. Well, here's some more examples, and I really don't want to spend time in his various words here. But here is what he's offering: is the process of semantic change can make things even more difficult, especially in a language with as long a history as Greek, as the word's usage comes to be very different from the original root meaning of the word. Well, this is critical too. Now, I'm sure this is what he would say. See, this is me understanding biblical languages, where he's saying you have to understand there's a process of semantic change. The linguistic drift. What something meant in this day comes to mean something else later because of linguistic drift. He's offering this as his, I think this is what he's doing. He's offering this as an example of him knowing what happened with the biblical languages, because he's saying that semantic changes, the changing of the meaning of the word, can make things even more difficult, and especially in an old language like Greek, as words usages come to be very different than the original root meaning of the word. And as it turns out, and then that is his introduction into what he's really going to say. As it turns out, the word Sabbaton, this is Sabbaton, is one of those words. By the first century had come to have more than one meaning. So let me reread that. As it turns out, the word Sabbaton is one of those words that by the first century had come to have more than one meaning. I cry foul. You only can have it getting to one meaning using the passages and questions that they've taken liberty of changing Sabbaton into week, because they needed it to be week so that they could turn Mia into first day of the week and get the resurrection on the first day of the week, which was Sunday, under which they get all of these doctrines that they're teaching their elect, their chosen, their people. It's important that they do that to the word Sabbaton, but no way. The fact that we are now translating, it's the translators who have given us that meaning. And that's born out of necessity, because the writer did not give us that meaning. The writer of Timiaton Sabbaton, or even the passage in Luke, the writer meant Sabbath. They understood it to be Sabbath. When they used Sabbath, they understood it to be Sabbath. If they used Sabbaton, they understood it to be Sabbaths. If they used Sabbatu, they understood it to be Sabbath. They knew what the meaning was. It's the translators, it's the church and the translators who have come to give it more than one meaning. And the only reason it has more than one meaning is that they've placed that meaning on it. The church, the translators gave us that meaning. It is not born out of Greek. We do not have the drift, the linguistic drift of Sabbaton, except as it was rendered to us in these passages by the church. We see it nowhere else in any use. The 3 times that we see it happening in the Septuagint are all related to the same kind of teaching and rationale. Okay, so let's keep moving. It originally referred to the Sabbath day by itself, the 7th day of the week, which we call Saturday. Okay, it did originally mean that. Everybody in the time that it was written understood that to be exactly what it meant. It was the 7th day Sabbath. Or what most people also forget in the church is it isn't maybe just the Sabbath, the 7th day Sabbath all by itself. We had the Moedim Sabbaths also, that maybe in different contexts needed to be differentiated from the weekly Sabbaths. They're all at large. Not 52 weekly Sabbaths, but 58 Sabbaths altogether. And at large, they're all Sabbaths. But sometimes you need to differentiate between the weekly Sabbaths and the Moedim Sabbaths. So maybe there are some usages of phraseology that the Greek writers of the day would have employed, but changing it to week is not one of them. But it came over time, it came to have a second meaning. Really? Over time, and over time only because the church gave us that second meaning. The translators gave us that second meaning. All of the translations that are created to reflect church teaching and embrace church teaching, because, and I really don't even blame the translators, because they had no reason to really question the church. They were trusting the church also. And I'm not saying the church isn't to be trusted, but the enemy has made his way into the church and really started giving us the doctrines of demons clear back in the 2nd and 3rd century, maybe even the 1st century. So the translators, I don't fully blame the translators because I think they're making honest mistakes, but they're assuming that the church must be true. And so this must be the case, and then they build it around it. But I would tell you the church gave Sabbath a second meaning. The week itself, using the word for the final day of the week to denote the week itself, calling the whole thing by the name of its parts. This is rationalization. This is self-justification. They introduce the second meaning and then start explaining it away and acting as though this is education. This is, if you really understood what was taking place, you would understand this to be the case. So they're justifying it as scholarship, knowing things. That the second meaning is that the whole week used for the final, using the word for the final day of the week is designed to mean the whole week itself, calling the whole thing by the nature of its parts. Well, no, I cry foul. Never does that happen. You don't have any examples of that anywhere that I know, certainly not in scriptures, that we have Sabbath becoming known as week itself at the time of the writings. Only through the translations and only through the explanations and the doctrines of the church do we begin to see this morph of the use of Sabbath as week because it's expedient to them. That's it. Like calling an older man a gray beard is sometimes called synodoche. I'm not sure why I didn't look that up. As a result, the word usually has, here's what he's saying. Here's where that arrives him at. As a result, the word usually has its original meaning of Sabbath, but depending on context, also meant week. Nope. I'm going to say never did it have week. Only, again, this is redundant, but this is the issue. Only if you accept those 9 times in the new writings, and you can add the 3 of the superscripts of the Psalms from the Septuagint if you want, but only in those times, in that context where they need Sabbath to be week so that they can make it the first day of or the second day of. In that context, they need it to be week. Those are the only times, 12 altogether in all of Scripture, where they have taken Sabbath and turned it into a week. And always it's with the need to get to a first, second, third day of the week. So it is, except for the one passage in Luke 18:12. So it's just it's entirely born out of church doctrine, church teaching, which has influence the translations. The average person is only reading the translations. All you ever see in the church is, fine, go to the NS. Find that the NIV is too much of a paraphrase and you want to get more literal. Where do you turn to? You turn to the NASB, right? Because it's supposed to be a more literal translation. If you don't like that, you might go to the King James Version, a literal translation. Or you might go to the ones that literally are translating are trying to be more of a word-for-word translation, but all of them are giving every reader first day of the week. So as a church, the church gave it to the translators gave it to us in all of the translations where we've taken Timiaton, Sabbaton, literally on one of the Sabbaths, and translated it into first day of the week, and now it's completely ingrained in our church doctrine. Everybody who reads and thinks they're studying scripture and reading first day of the week are hearing it as first day of the week. And so their entire doctrinal, it's just all born out of that. Okay, so, but if you can, and this is what you really need to do if you're being serious about this, if you want to be as an elect, as a chosen, as a church member, if you really want to find out what the context is, you can't go to the translations, you got to go to the Greek itself. You got to go to the Greek itself because that's what they didn't change. Everything else you're going to read is going to be changed with the exception of one or two translations like the Hallelujah Scriptures and the RST&E. And if there are others, I really don't know who they are. All right, let's keep going to finish this out. As a result, the word usually has the original meaning of Sabbath, but depending upon context, also can mean week. And he's going to visit 1 Corinthians 16:2, where he says, on the first day of every Sabbath, each one of you is to put aside and save. And then he says, see how this cannot make sense? You can't say first day of every Sabbath. It'd be nonsense, he says. And why? Because there is no first day, no second day, no third day of a Sabbath. There's only one day of a Sabbath, so it would make no sense as he's telling us it must mean. So the context shows that Paul is using the second meaning of the word here. No, I cry foul. What is the passage in question? Okay, so here's his argument, and here's the passage. Kata, in the transliterated Greek, it's kata mian for one, Sabbatou, the singular the genitive. Well, here you go. It's the genitive neuter singular form, and you've got mian, the accusative. Actually, now this is mian in the accusative form, but it's still feminine, and it can't modify Sabbatou, so we've got to go get a day somewhere. So what he's saying is he's accepted, now that we've taken those other passages and come to believe that since we turn Sabbath into week, we have a first day of the week. So when we say mian, we're talking about first day of the week. And now he's just employing that mian to be first day against Sabbaton, and it can't make sense to him. But again, you don't get to first day without first moving and redefining Sabbato to week. And that's not what this writer did. He did not employ the word week. By the way, in case you didn't know, there are Greek words for week. Let me show you. Here's what the Greek word for week is. Here's week here. Let's see if we can do a couple more. Just kind of go through them. That's a subscript. Here is week. Here's the Greek word for week. Greek word for week. And in the transliterated Greek, it's hebdoma or hebdomada or something of that nature. All part of, if you really want to find more information on that, go to the video that I had, the previous video, the 3-hour video, Miaton Sabbaton, a discussion with the Greek scholar. So then, rather than accept what he just gave us, which is that makes no sense as every one Sabbath, which would be first day of the Sabbath in his mind. Let's take the literal Greek. If we have to insert day, what would it be? Every one day of the Sabbath, or every one Sabbath of the Sabbath days. Every one of the Sabbath days. If you employ days here, because you have an ellipsis, you have to insert the feminine noun for day, which is days, and you have every one of the Sabbath days. That's back to every Sabbath lay aside. Every one of you put aside a treasuring up. Basically lay aside your tithe. So he's saying it can't make sense, but that's just because he's employed the explanations here. They've done all this violence to the actual Greek language to get them their justifications for doing what they say they're doing on the first day of the Sabbath would be nonsense. Well, it would be nonsense because you're treating mian as first day when it's just one of the Sabbath days. Every one of the Sabbath days. That's all it means. So it's the phrase, as Paul wrote it, it's not nonsense. It's only nonsense in our translations as we have employed all of the rationale they're providing us. Then it becomes nonsense. And I say, don't quit employing their nonsense. Their nonsense, which is first turning Sabbath into week, and which then causes you to want to treat Mia as first day, and you will always need to have day in there. You're going to have a mirror alongside of Mia, to ever get a day one or a first day, you're going to have them. You're going to have day employed to get first alongside of a Mia. So it's all nonsense. But this does not mean that Paul is employing the second meaning of the word. It means that English translations are doing so, and that church teaching and doctrines are doing so. All right, let's keep on going here. And I'm sorry, this video is turning out to be much longer than I had hoped. The same is true where it's translated week in Matthew 28 and Luke 18:12, etc. That's why the translators dared to translate Sabbaton as week. Well, first of all, they didn't translate Sabbaton as week. They translated Sabbaton as week. In these cases, the context and the standard usage of the word indicate in these cases that's what Sabbaton meant. No, it doesn't. Only if you don't know the context of the week, you don't know that there were 2 Sabbaths already in the week, and you don't know that you need to differentiate between the Sabbath in the week and the end of the week Sabbath. If you don't know that, then it's all a problem, and then you've got to make up other things. But that's what he's saying. Then in context and standard usage of the word indicate that in these cases, that's what Sabbaton meant. Well, nope, standard usage that they say indicates is just those 9 passages that they're using as justification for turning Sabbath into week, and doesn't hold water, and that's what I'm saying. And you don't need to. You just don't need to. So in the end of Sabbaths, at the dawning toward the first of the Sabbaths, came Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to see the sculptor, to expand on it. Now, okay. So he's basically using what the other gentleman wrote at the end of the Sabbath, which was the end of the 2 Sabbaths. You know, the one that Yahushua kept and the one that the Pharisees kept, possibly. Or literally, they just knew what that meant, I suppose, that to say after, and this would be after the Sabbaths, actually. At the dawning of the first day, on the first of the Sabbath day, on one of the Sabbath days. It's all it's really communicating to us in Matthew 28. Now that the era of Old Testament Sabbaths has come to an end, all right, no. This is just restating, he's just restating again. And he's telling us what that would mean. Instead, it should be translated something like this. Now, after the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week. Nope. Sabbaton is first day of the week. Is not. It's on one of the Sabbath days. And after the Sabbath, maybe, because if you just meant one of those 2 Sabbaths, the Sabbath that Yahushua and the Zadokians would have been keeping versus the Sabbath, the next Sabbath that all of Yehuda, the majority, the mainstream Yehudim, Jews would have been keeping, we would actually have had 2 Sabbaths. But even so, you could treat it as Sabbath. I mean, if you want to, because if you only see one Sabbath, but they're struggling because they're not even acknowledging that midweek Sabbath. They don't even know. Greek's idiom is a little different from English here. We tend to say at dawn of the day, while they say while it is dawning towards the day. Both idioms refer to the same thing, so I've rendered it in more understandable English, and I say no. This is the teaching of the church. These are the explanations being handed to us. I say church, elect, chosen, stop, don't. The passage, the writer meant on one of the Sabbath days. The church has handed us and documented, given us all the translations to keep enforcing the idea that Yahushua was risen not on the Sabbath, but on the first day of the week. All right. I'm all for looking for translation improvements, but this is one place where the translators tend to get things right. This is the assertion even in some of the Torah communities that we listen to, because they can embrace that Yahushua was risen on the Sabbath, but they think it's, so many of them think that's later in the day on the Sabbath. But to do that, you have to do something with the passage pro T. Let me go get it. You have to do something with this passage, Mark 16:9, where it reads pro T Sabbath, which would be first thing, chief, foremost thing on that day. So the concept is, the very first thing that happened on this Sabbath day was that Yahushua had risen. Well, in the Torah communities where they have accepted the idea that Yahushua was risen, if they go with the whole, I don't really want to build it here because I've done it elsewhere, and I may do it again because we have the resurrection week coming up again. But they build where Yahushua would have been risen at the 9th hour on the Sabbath day, which would be around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And so the problem with this passage is if you have him risen first thing on the Sabbath, well, he can't be risen, can't rise at 3 o'clock later in the afternoon. So they've got to do something with this passage. They just struggle to do it. So they accept this treatment of it as having risen first day of the week. I really don't know for sure what they do with it because it's a problem for them. But then they can deal with all the Miaton Sabbatons where it's being translated as first day of the week when the women came, and they support this. I mean, we hear it. I've heard it. Somebody that I was originally following and trying to watch to see what he had to say about observing Torah as I became aware that I needed to begin learning what that meant to me and how I needed to begin walking that out in my life. So you turn to these various teachers, and one of them is pretty much saying, you're going to argue with all the Greek translators? You think you know more than the Greek translators? Well, no, not in Greek, I don't. But when it comes to this topic, I think so now. I think there are Greek translators who know what I'm talking about and know it's happening, understand, and maybe even are questioning it themselves. But then we have a whole lot of Greek translators that are just going along with church doctrine. The base understanding that this event, this Yahushua had to be risen on the first day of the week because all of church doctrine is based upon that, and they have to embrace it. And even when they start trying to employ their timeline of the resurrection week, they still have to embrace this definition of Miaton Sabbaton, because if the women showed up early on the first day of the week to find Yahushua risen, again, they can't have the resurrection later in the day. And that's a pretty common understanding in the Torah circles. I say that's a wrong understanding. He was risen first thing on the Sabbath, and I've got timelines that show it. When you begin to use the Zadokian calendar and understand that they were using not an evening to evening day, but the day began in the morning, all the timelines fit, and you don't need to do violence to any of these. Once you understand that all of these passages all are harmonious and support the timeline that I come up with. All right, it's so frustrating. I meant this to be a 20-minute video as well. Just doesn't seem like it could be done. Maybe it's me. Maybe it's me. I'm too verbose. Maybe the subject matter for me is too deep, but I think it really is. I don't know that it could be done in 20 minutes unless we really break it apart into even smaller concepts. I don't know how it could be done because really it's so ingrained. We must first, to understand what I'm saying, you must first undo all the church doctrine you ever heard about Yahushua being risen on the first day of the week and all the doctrines that flow from that. The Lord's Day, Easter Sunday, and even the concepts of the New Covenant are dependent upon this translation. And it's necessary. They need it, and they've ensconced it, and it's in every single. You're not going to fix it by going from one translation to another translation. You're going to see first day of the week over and over again because that's what the church is teaching, and that has to be undone. And I don't know how to do that quickly, maybe. I think I'm trying to do it by showing the results of, in this video, showing the results of, what biblical church teaching and doctrine, where it has led people into this kind of confusion where they can't make sense of the scriptures, which is a shame because the scriptures do make sense as you begin to parse them, as you begin to spend time in them and gather up and educate yourself on them. They make more and more sense as they are written and not as they are retranslated and redefined for us by church doctrine. In fact, if you're going to embrace church doctrine, you will be and stay confused because it cannot work. It cannot work without employing all of their explanations, which are extra biblical. Lose their explanations. Listen to what I'm saying about the timeline of the resurrection week and what's happened with Sabbath, and start spending your own time in it. Go back to the Greek and hear what I'm saying, and then go do your own timeline. Go do understand what I'm saying, and then go do your own timeline and see if it doesn't lead you to the same conclusions that I am drawing for you here. All right. Well, thank you, and may you be Baruch.